Great to be back with you. David Capes is my name. Yes, C-A-P-E-S. Batman and Robin wear capes. That's me. It's not Capes. It's not Caps. It's not Cates. It's any of those things. I've been called a lot of things in my life. When we moved to Houston back in 1990, there was only one other family with that same last name. And now, since I've been having children, there's a few more, so which is always a good thing. I teach at Houston Graduate School of Theology, at least for the next 6 weeks. After that, I'm going to Wheaton College to teach up there. My wife and I will be leaving Houston and going to colder climates up there. I'll be the associate dean in the department, the biblical and the theological research studies department there. So we're going to be missing you up there, but I told Mark he needs to bring me back from time to time. So you be sure to tell him that. And it'll be good to teach. A few weeks ago, I was with you to talk about the Gospel of Mark. And before that, in fact, it's been almost a year ago, 10 months ago, I was here talking about the two little letters called 2nd and 3rd John. But today, Mark has asked me to talk about the Apostle Paul. Now, I don't have a song by Phil Keaggy. I'm sorry today. I'm deeply disappointed. I love Phil Keaggy, love his music. I got to hear him in concert one time in Roswell, Georgia, back 30 years ago probably now, and look forward to one day getting an opportunity maybe meeting him. I have, however, written the official Lanier Library song. You may have heard of it. It's called Mark Lanierville, and it's to the tune of Margaritaville, right? So can I say that in a Baptist church? Is that okay? It's a figurative thing, right? It's just not literal, but it's a figure. But anyway, Mark Lanierville is the name of the song. So it's been a lot of fun. Mark and I both like song parodies. But it is a delight to be back with you to talk about Paul. Let's see, if we get our technology moving along. Here we go. Not moving. Okay, here we go. There we go. All right. One of the reasons Mark asked me to talk about this is I've written a few books on Paul. One is called Rediscovering Paul, and the second one is called Rediscovering Paul. It's the second edition. It's coming out next year. And Mark asked me specifically to talk about surprises along the way, things that I have learned about Paul that I didn't know and I felt were kind of interesting and important for us to know. And so that's what I'm going to be sharing with you today. I have two other books on Paul. My first one was published in Germany many, many years ago. It's going to be republished by Baylor University Press. It's more focused upon Paul's Christology, Paul's understanding of the significance of Jesus, who is Jesus, and particularly how he read the Old Testament over against that. And then I have another book, a similar book coming out with Baker next year called The Divine Christ, Paul, the Lord Jesus, and the Scriptures of Israel. I cover some of the same ground, but I'm really focused in upon how Paul understood the significance of Jesus in his day. We take for granted our faith. We take for granted the hymns that we sing, the prayers that we pray, the scriptures. Paul did not have a New Testament, right? Paul's Bible was the Old Testament, what we call the Old Testament. So he didn't have Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John. He didn't have Hebrews or Revelation. So he didn't have all of the stuff that we have. And so we take for granted, I believe, a lot of things that Paul was having to innovate in his day as he experienced Jesus himself, as he was a missionary himself, probably one of the greatest missionaries of all time. So we're going to be talking a little bit about that today. One of the things, a couple of things that I'm not going to talk about, but things that surprised me. I grew up thinking that the Pharisee Saul changed his name to Paul when he became a Christian, right? That's a very common thing. But it's a misunderstanding. It's a basic misunderstanding. And here's the reality of it. I don't have time to go into all the details. Because Saul was a Jew and because Saul was a Roman citizen, he had two names. His Jewish name was Shaul, Saul. His Roman name was Paulos. When he's palling around with Jews, he goes by the name Shaul. When he's around Greeks and he's the missionary, the apostle to the Gentiles, he goes by the name Paulos. I was in Chicago the other day getting ready for our trip up there, and I met a guy named Rabbi Bob. Rabbi Bob. And I said, I know enough about Jewish people to know, what's your real name? People like me know him as Bob, but he said, my real name, my Jewish name is Simcha. One of my best friends is a rabbi. I know him as Stuart. I call him Stuart. But his Jewish name, the name by which the Jewish people call him, is the name Shimon. So if you know a Jewish person, the chances are pretty good that they have two names. And what we find when we come to the Apostle Paul is that when he's around Jews, he'll use his Jewish name. When he's around non-Jews, he uses his other name, Paulos. And there's more to it than that, but that's one of the things. One of the things, too, I really was interested in is why in the world was Paul so adamant that he wanted to destroy the faith, the Christian faith? We know him and we meet him, first of all, as a Pharisee who's standing by approving the martyrdom, if you will, the death, the stoning of Stephen. And he goes on to say in his little letter called Galatians, he says, "You know of my former life in Judaism, how I was violently persecuting the church. I was filled with zeal for God." And I began wondering, what is it about the Christian faith that Paul thought it was okay to destroy people, to kill people? And that's a whole nother lesson. But it's one of the things that I think is really significant about studying Paul. What is it that Paul thought? Why were these Christians considered by him a clear and present danger enough to destroy them and to try to destroy the movement that we call today the church? It's an important part of it. Lots of other things. One of the things I love about Paul, and I didn't understand at one time about Paul, was the fact that Paul had the audacity to say, "Imitate me." Right? Does anybody say that? Some of us do. Some of us have the audacity. Most of us today say, "Oh, don't put me on a pedestal. Don't watch me. Don't do what I." What does it saying? Don't do what I say. Do what I what? Do. See, Paul, or is it the other way around? Right? I don't do the right stuff. Paul had the audacity, and he knew something about human beings that we're hardwired to imitate something. That's why we say Pakistan and not Pakistan, because we imitate language, right? When we live in a particular area, we learn to speak a certain way. We learn to walk a certain way. We learn to conduct ourselves in a certain way because we are hardwired as human beings to imitate somebody. And Paul had the audacity to say, "Imitate me." Because if you imitate me, you'll be imitating Christ. And if you imitate Christ, you'll be imitating God. So Paul would say, "Watch me when I get up in the morning. Watch me as I go through my day. If you do the things that I do, you'll become like Jesus." That's a pretty audacious thing to say. But it's a bold thing to say and an important thing to say as we understand that how we are formed in the faith, how we are formed as human beings. Lots of stuff about Paul that I've learned along the way. Let me start with this Paul's missionary strategy. If we are to imitate Paul, if we are to watch what he does and do what he does and say the kinds of things that he says, if that's really true, then we need to know something about how he himself was a missionary. And our family that was up here earlier probably understands this better than anybody in the room, better than I do. Here are several aspects of Paul's missionary strategy. One is that two heads are better than one. In other words, Paul never engaged in mission by himself. He always was engaged with other people. He was always partnering with somebody. Now, those people changed over his 20 or so year career as a missionary, as the apostle to the Gentiles. But he was working with people, always trying to find somebody to work with, to partner with, because he knew that, in fact, if the gospel was going to be proclaimed and lived out and expressed, that he needed some help. He was a vastly talented person, but he knew he needed some help. Second thing is he had an urban strategy. Why an urban strategy? Well, urban, that's where people are. You go to where people are. You just don't show up in the middle of nowhere and try to do your work. You go to a place like Islamabad. You go to a place like New Delhi. You go to a place like Washington, D.C., because there are a lot of people there. And even in the ancient world, people who lived in the villages would come to the city twice a week on market days, Mondays and Thursdays. That's when people shopped. So they would go to the market 2 days a week. That was enough. And so they would go to the market, and guess what? Paul would be in the market. He would be in the market with his friends, with his co-workers, and they'd be sharing the gospel some way. You go to where people are. A third part of the strategy, he went to the Jew first. We see this over and over again. Romans chapter 1. I am not ashamed of the gospel. The power of God it is literally what Paul says. It is God's power to save. To the Jew first, but also to the Greek. So when Paul was traveling and he showed up in a city, he didn't go look for the atheist convention and say, let me try to convert these people. No, he went to where people already believed in God and already had a sense of the God that he was going to be describing and preaching and proclaiming. So he went to the Jews first. When that didn't work out, and if that didn't work out, he went then to the Gentiles, to the non-Jews. But he didn't go just to any Gentiles. There were Gentiles hanging on to synagogues. They were called God-fearers. They were people already attracted to the one God of Israel, already attracted to the morality of the Jewish people, already attracted to who they were and their identity. And that's where Paul had his greatest success, working among the God-fearers who had come together and had been attracted to the Jewish synagogues there in city after city. Here's a fourth part of the strategy. Stay healthy. Paul knew that a dead apostle is not much good. So when he could, he tried to stay out of prison. Now, he wasn't always successful. When he could, he tried to avoid being stoned and being flogged. He wasn't always successful. But he would, when the opposition reached a certain level, he would say, time to move on. Time to go to the next city. In some places, he was there for weeks. In some places, he was there for months. Some places, he was there for years, like Ephesus. Nearly 3 years in Ephesus. And so Paul understood how important it was for him to stay healthy, to stay well, to stay out of prison if he could. But again, sometimes he's not. And prison has a completely different function in the ancient world than it does today. In fact, prison in the ancient world is more like what happens in most of the rest of the world, and not in terms of a punishment, but in terms of getting troublesome people out of the way so that they don't trouble you any longer. The next thing he did, and this goes back to his name, he found common ground. Wherever he could, Paul tried to find common ground. He quoted the poets, the Greek poets. He quoted the Jewish scriptures when he's among the Jews. He would find a way to talk about what we all have in common as human beings. And Paul worked from that. Another part of it, he would share the kerygma. Now, that's a big fancy word. It's a Greek word. It means the preaching, the proclamation. This is the essential message about Jesus that's being proclaimed in Paul's day. And it boils down to 6 things. I learned the 4 spiritual laws. In fact, there are 6 of them if you follow the New Testament and the book of Acts and Paul's letters. And here's the things. Number 1, that Jesus inaugurated the fulfillment of messianic prophecy. Now, each word in this is really important. I could spend an hour almost on each one of these. Jesus began the process of fulfilling prophecy. He hasn't fulfilled it all yet, but he will in his second coming. He fulfilled a lot of it. He even fulfilled things that people didn't know were prophecies. More about that on another occasion. Things that were embedded in the scriptures, in the Psalms, for example. Psalm 118, the stone the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. It's the Lord's doing. It's marvelous in our eyes. This is the day the Lord has made. I will rejoice and be glad in it. Jesus fulfilled that poem, that prophetic poem embedded within the Psalms. Second, he went about doing good. Jesus went about doing good, performing miracles. We all know about those stories. Third, he was crucified according to God's plan. It was important to say he was crucified, going back to what Brent was saying earlier. Crucified according to God's plan. You couldn't just say he suffered, you didn't say he died. In some cases, Paul said that. But over and over again, Paul talked about how he was crucified for us. How it's a scandal, a crucified king that we worship, that we bow down before one who has been so shamefully treated. Paul said, this is a scandal. It's foolishness. But to those who are being saved by it, transformed by it, helped by it, it is the wisdom of God. And we stand back, we say, oh, now I see this grand and glorious wisdom. I see the plan. a plan that people had never seen before until they bowed before the crucified and risen Messiah. He was crucified according to God's plan. It didn't catch God off guard. God knew this was going to happen. God, in a sense, planned for it to happen. On a human level, it's a terrible tragedy. A good man like Jesus being misunderstood, being treated like he was treated, and ultimately being crucified. But it was God's plan, start to finish. Item 4, he was resurrected and exalted to God's right hand. Notice that each one of these are past tense. This is stuff that's already happened. When we come to the 5th bullet, that's future tense. He will come again in glory, power, and judgment. Now, what are we doing? We're talking about the essential message of Paul. This is the message he preached, he proclaimed to all the churches when he showed up in Thessalonica, in Philippi, in Corinth. These are the essential ideas about what God is up to and what God is doing. Item number 6 is an invitation. If all of that above is true, if Jesus really has inaugurated the fulfillment of Messianic prophecy, if he really was crucified according to God's plan, if he really was resurrected and exalted to the right hand of God, if that's true, it demands something of you and me. We can't just say, oh, isn't that nice? Or isn't that wonderful? Or isn't that strange? It demands that we repent, we change our ways, we believe, and that we be baptized. And then God will give us His Spirit. Then God will give us the forgiveness of sins. This is the essential message of Paul, preached in churches, written about in letters over and over and over again. This was the message that Paul preached. And so he established churches with this message. This message became the foundation story, the master story, as Mike Gorman calls it, the master story that he proclaimed everywhere he went. And he established churches. And when he was getting ready to leave, and he had to leave, he started lots of churches, he would appoint leaders. He would say, I want you to be pastor, I want you to be minister of music, I want you to be the minister of children. Not really. He didn't say that exactly, but he found people who were gifted, and he said, I need you to step up. And he appointed people as leaders. A lot of times that was fairly natural and fairly organic, I think. And when he could, Paul would revisit the churches that he founded. We know, for example, on the first missionary journey, he started the Galatian churches. And then on the second journey, he revisited those churches. Then on his third journey, he revisited those churches. But he couldn't always go back. Travel is hard. Paul was getting older. Paul was in prison. Winters are rough in that part of the world. It's cold, mountainous, hilly, hard to travel. You only really travel from March to September, March to October, because it was too hard otherwise. But he would revisit the church, and if he couldn't go, he would send somebody else. We're going to see that in a couple of letters in just a moment. He would send delegates. He would send people to be his surrogates. He said, I'm going to send you Tychicus. He's going to remind you, listen to this, of my ways. Why? Because if you follow my ways and do what I do and say what I say, you're going to be like Jesus. He's going to bring you up to speed on what's happening with me as your apostle, as your founder. So he had a privileged place in all of these things. And finally, when all of this has been done over and over again, Paul would write letters. Now, I'm fairly convinced that Paul believed that when he left this world, his true legacy were the churches that he founded. Imagine founding the First Baptist Church of Ephesus, or the first church of Corinth. I think when Paul left this world, he really thought that his churches would be his legacy. He says to the Corinthians, he said, you are my letter of recommendation, written on the heart. You people are my future, my legacy. But in fact, God had something else in plan. And that plan was for Paul's letters to survive and to become the centerpiece of our New Testament. 27 books in the New Testament. How many did Paul write? Most of them, yeah. Yeah, good answer. 27 books in our New Testament. Paul wrote 13 letters. And one book, the longest book in the New Testament is what book? Not Romans. I'm thinking about just the whole New Testament. Book of Acts, the longest book. And half of that book is about Paul. So you could say that half of our New Testament is directly related to Paul's teaching, Paul's example, Paul's living the gospel when Paul says, imitate me. Because if you do, watch me, and if you do, you'll see Jesus. And if you see Jesus, you'll want to follow Jesus. Now, Paul would also say very humbly, I'm the chiefest of sinners. I don't deserve to be an apostle. Paul sort of went back and forth between the two, but at the end of the day, he knew that you and I, as human beings, are hardwired to look and to admire people and to want to fashion our lives after those people. We do that all the time, particularly children, but also adults, as we move along here. Well, whenever I thought of Paul writing letters, I thought of it like this, right? Famous painting by Rembrandt, I think 1657 is the date. And for those of you who are experts in art history, please forgive me. I can only, as an observer, appreciative, describe what I'm seeing here. There are 3 points of light. One point of light in this rim is on the face of the apostle. A second point is on his right hand, point of light, him writing a letter. And then you see the desk over here, the desk upon which he is writing. Now, this presumes something. It presumes that Paul was a man of the Renaissance, that Paul was dressed like men, particularly well-to-do men, in the Renaissance, that he sat at a desk alone, solitary, and writing his letters. He was very contemplative. He would think before he would write, word after word, writing these grand and wonderful and glorious letters. In fact, that is not the way it happened. It's a great picture. It's a great legacy of Rembrandt's work. But this is not at all how Paul wrote letters. Well, we know that because of things that Paul does. In fact, Paul tells us that writing letters is not a solitary individual affair. Paul tells us that writing his letters was a communal enterprise. It's something that he did with other people. So the letters that we have are Paul, yes, he's the team leader, and yet they have been influenced by people whose names we just barely know. People like Sosthenes, people like Silvanus. And so when Paul is writing his letters, there are co-senders who are participating in that process. Other people who are writing with him. Other people contributing to the letter. There are amanuenses, that is secretaries. Paul could write because he could write, but he wasn't very good at it. In the ancient world, literacy meant you could read, not that you could write. But Paul could write. It's just when he did, his letters were big and clumsy. How do we know that? Galatians 6:11. I'll show you that in a minute. The other thing is that Paul, when he's writing letters, doesn't hesitate to quote stuff that he likes, like hymns and creeds and other little bits that he finds being said in the churches. And we'll see some examples of that. For example, lists of virtues and vices. Paul doesn't make those up on the spur. He takes those that are being preached and described in the churches. There are qualifications for leadership. My doctor, Father Earl Ellis, wrote a brilliant article many years ago arguing that, and I think he's persuaded me at least, that, and others, that those qualifications for what it means to be a leader in Timothy, you know, a man above reproach, the husband of one wife, not a lover of money, not greedy for gain, all of those kinds of things are really standardized teachings of the church that Paul is sharing with Timothy, that have been sort of worked out among churches that Paul knows. By the Spirit, obviously, and given to us by the Spirit. So when we come to the letters, these are just a few of the co-senders. Now, let me see if I'm going to come to Elmo here. Can I play with Elmo? Elmo. One of my favorite letters is the little letter called 1 Corinthians. Let me find it. And we can see the beginning of it here. All right, we got to get the thing. All right, here's the beginning of the letter. I'm going to write in this Bible. It's not a sin to write in the Bible. Sin to write in the hymn book, but not in the. Don't write in the hymn book. This is how it begins. Paul's always the team leader. He's the most famous guy. His name always goes first. I've written books where my name goes first, and I've written books where my name goes last, because the people that I'm writing with are better known than I am. That's how publishers work these days. Normally, if everybody's on pretty much the same level, they'll do it in alphabetical order. But if there's somebody who's better known in a particular community, they'll put names. So this is what happens here in Paul. So Paul, are we right there? Am I? Oh, that. Focus. Thank you. There we go. Is that better? A little better. All right. Paul, called by the will of God to be an apostle of Christ Jesus. And notice, and our brother Sosthenes. Now, this is Paul's letter, but he is not by himself in writing the letter. He claims as a co-sender of the letter a fellow that we know very little about, a guy named Sosthenes. Are we to imagine he contributed nothing to this book? Well, then why would Paul name him along the way? And we can look at the other letters. We go back to the slide. We can look at the other letters, and we can see other people being named. Paul, Silvanus, and Timothy. Paul, Silvanus, and Timothy. Paul and Timothy. Timothy was really a big deal. Paul was with Timothy on a lot of occasions. They're co-writers with him along this. Paul knew that he needed help. 2 heads are better than one. Some letters are written by himself. Likely those are mostly prison letters that Paul is writing from prison. Paul had access to a secretary, though, at the time. I'll show you about that later. Now, this is all over the page. I'm sorry about that. The font didn't work out. But Paul also, when he sent his letters, he sent them by couriers. And he sent them usually through notice he says here in Ephesians 6, I am sending Tychicus to you. He's going to remind you of my ways. He's going to fill you in on all the gaps that you don't know about me, that you want to know about me. Because if you study my ways, you'll be like Christ, if you know what I'm going to do. Colossians 4, I am sending this letter by Tychicus and Onesimus. 2 people were couriers for this particular letter. And then there are the amanuenses. These are the secretaries. Come back to Elmo for just a minute. Over in Galatians, this is this wonderful little thing that Paul writes. Let's see if I can find it. It's going to be down here. 6:11. It was Paul's habit, because Paul could write, at the very end of a letter to pick up the pen and write. Most of the letter is going to be put ink on papyrus by a secretary. We know that from a bunch of letters, and we can see that. But here in particular, I want you to notice what he says. He's writing. He's coming down to the end of it. And he says, see what large letters I'm writing to you with my own hand. Now, the word letter here is a little bit, in English, confusing. Because a letter could be Galatians and Colossians. But this word letter means alphabetic characters. Look at what large letters I'm writing to you when I'm writing in my own hand. Paul was a leather worker by trade. And so when Paul could write, he could write letters, but he wasn't very good at it. When he wrote large. The reason today that you can write is because when you were 2 or 3 years old, they put a big fat crayon in your hand, right? You remember that? They gave you a big piece of paper and you started doing this, didn't you? And gradually, over many, many years of training, you get to the point between your eye and your shoulder and the muscles of the arm and the muscles on the hand and the tendons and all that working together to where you can write legibly. And as you grow older, some of you who are older understand, your handwriting begins to deteriorate because those muscles don't quite work the way, the eyes don't quite work the way. But it's to write something and to write it well takes an immense amount of skill. Paul, by his vocation, was a leather worker. He pushed big needles through leather, sewed them together, but he wasn't very good at the little intricacies of writing. And so he used a secretary to write most of his letters. And at the very end, he would pick up the pen to authenticate it. In one letter, he said, I'm writing this greeting in my own hand. This is the way that I write. Remember that. Just like we today in writing a letter, we authenticate it with a signature. That one signature sort of indicates who we are, and people are determined by that particular signature. Now, moving back. I didn't know this. What did it cost to produce a letter in Paul's day? To hire a secretary. The paper that they were writing on took 7 days to make. The secretary had to trim the paper. He had to score the lines. He had to make multiple drafts. He started on wax tablets. We have those today. We know what kind of tablets, the wooden tablets that have a wax coating, and that's how they would start writing. They would make multiple drafts of these letters over and over again. He had to make his own pen. He had to make his own ink. It took a while. And secretaries charged by the line, the stikoi. Those lines. So most people wrote short letters, right? Most people couldn't write. Only 8 to 10% were literate, meaning they could read. Just because you could read, though, didn't mean that you could write in that day because of the access or lack of access to writing materials. Now, when Paul wrote, his secretary would help prepare it, and it has been conservatively estimated that to create a letter like we know today, the long letter, the immensely long letter of 1 Corinthians, take about $2,100 in today's economy. Now, this was figured back in the 2007 by that economy. I don't know today. The little letter of Galatians, about $700. The shortest letter of Paul, one letter, one page, about $100. So please understand, when Paul's writing a letter, he's just not just, okay, let's just write a letter. No, this is in planning. He's working with secretaries. He's working with co-senders. He's crafting the language. He's taking preformed hymns from the church. He's taking creeds from the church and sharing those as part of his message. It's part of the texture of his letters. It's an amazing thing that we today have the privilege of reading those letters. Half of the New Testament has been written by Paul or has been inspired by Paul. I would even argue the Gospel of Mark has a particular Pauline sort of flavor, twist along the way. And then letters had to be finished. Letters had to be folded. They folded like an accordion in those days. This is a virtual one. It's not ancient. But this is what it would look like. It would be folded in a particular way. It would have a cord or a papyrus tie. It would be sealed with a bit of clay. On the outside of it would have something like an address or where it was going or to whom it was to be given. When you got to the city of Colossae, this is the person that you need to find, etc. So this is how Paul's letters were sent. And he had only 2 ways of getting a letter from point A to point B. No mail system in those days. Not if you were working for the government, you had. But if you weren't working for the government, you had 2 ways. One was a happenstance carrier. It means basically you know somebody who's traveling from point A to point B, and you know somebody in that place. And so you hurriedly, in some cases, write a letter because you know that person is going to be traveling. And you want to give them that letter, and you hope and pray it's delivered. By the way, there were always a couple of different copies of a letter made because a letter could always be lost in transit, and many were. The other is a courier, a person that you commission directly to carry a letter from point A to point B. Paul did both. Paul had both happenstance carriers, but he also had people that were his couriers, people that he sent with the letter. He said, when you get there, read the letter to the people. And if they need any explanation of what I'm saying here, you were with me when I wrote it, you explain it to them. And you remind them of my ways. Because people who follow my ways will be following Jesus. Because I follow the way of Jesus. It's a bold, audacious thing to say. But nevertheless, Paul did say it. Well, we're just about out of time. Really quickly, Paul's letters, please understand, are not just some solitary lone affair that Paul hammers out by himself in a cell somewhere. Some letters are written from prison, but we know that Paul had access to people, secretaries who would come to him, and opportunities for him to write letters. We don't know how long these took. In some cases, I think it took weeks to write a letter. In some cases, maybe like 1 Corinthians, it might have taken months to write a letter like that because of all the different processes at work. So these letters aren't just something that Paul dashed off the top of his head. We get a little bit of that. We get a little flavor of that in some of the letters. But by and large, they're things that Paul has worked out with his colleagues, with the church, wherever he was, to send us the message of what Paul was on about. Well, we don't have time for that. Points for home. Let's talk about that. A few things to carry away from this whole notion about what it means to follow Jesus by following a follower of Jesus, right? Paul urged us to imitate me because I imitate Christ. Watch what I do, watch where I go, watch how I conduct myself, and you will see Jesus. And do that. And so we would do well, I think, to imitate Paul's missionary strategy. If you're a missionary in Islamabad, if you're a missionary in Conroe, if you're a missionary in Houston, or in Richmond where I live, or soon in Wheaton where I'm going to live in just a few weeks, if that's going to be true, what does it mean? Well, it means that you've got to work cooperatively. You've got to partner with other people. This is what Paul did. You've got to go to where people are. Some of us instinctively want to withdraw from people. But if we're called to be ministers and missionaries, if we're called to be that, we have to be where people are. And we have to start in places. If we're going to start this message, we got to start it where people are going to hear us favorably. Don't just assume that just anybody is going to be favorable to the message. Share that message. Know the gospel. Stay healthy. Do the best you can to stay healthy. Do the best you can to understand the true gospel and to share it pure and simple, unconnected from any sort of cultural piece that we sometimes carry with it. More about that maybe on another occasion. And then stay in touch. Notice, you can't live the Christian life by yourself. We know that instinctively, but some people aren't connected. Get connected. It's more than being a member. Getting connected means I want to take the gifts that God has given me and I want to employ them right here. I'm not fully aware of all the gifts that God has given me, so you need to reflect that back to me. It's a communal thing too. We understand our giftedness through the church. Not just, oh, I have the gift of prophecy, or oh, I have the gift of teaching, oh, I have the gift of this or that. No, the church helps us to work through and to work out and say, this is where your gifting is. And so get connected. Use your gifts for the common good. The good of this church, Champions Forest Baptist Church. Or if you're in Islamabad or wherever you might be, use it for the common good and drink deeply from the Christian tradition. I just finished reading a book by a friend of mine, Stefana Dan Lang. It's a book called Retrieving History. It's a brilliant book. The subtitle is Memory and Identity Formation in the Early Church. She's an expert in the first 5 centuries of the Christian movement. And this is what I wrote on my blog about the book, if you don't mind listening in for just a moment. Her point seems to be that here we are as believers in Jesus, right? Christ believers in the 21st century, and our identity is formed more by our culture than by our faith. Think about that. She thinks, and I agree, that the church right now is experiencing identity crisis. We reflect more of the culture today than our Christian heritage. When you look at what churches are and what churches are thinking about themselves, culture today has a tendency to focus on who or what is trending, what's hot, the news cycle. That's where culture is today. But notice, it's whatever's happening right now. She asked a great question. Now, she didn't ask this question, but I'm distilling down several questions she asked. Would the saints of the past, would Tertullian, would Augustine, would Luther, Calvin, would the saints of the past who show up be able to tell the difference between church and theater? It's a good question. It can go deeper into that. Notice, this is what she says. This is her writing now. Israel is admonished to remember, to stand at the crossroads, seeking out the ancient path, and the church today is merely just looking around instead of looking back. We would do well to spend a little bit of time looking back and reading and digesting some of the great saints of the past, some of their words, some of their actions, as we think about who we are. Now, this doesn't mean that we shouldn't be culturally relevant or we shouldn't understand our culture. None of that applies. What she's trying to say is if we want to really be the church and share the gospel and be the gospel, we have to understand the great tradition from which we come. We have to embrace it. We have to see parts of it that we apologize for, frankly, where we have erred. We have to understand all of that because that's something about, it tells us something about where we're going. And a part of what the church does is we live at this strange moment of history, representing, living, being the gospel like Paul was, and yet reaching back and pulling that past and embracing it and reaching out to the culture around us and embracing that and making ourselves connect with people in a deep and abiding and meaningful way. Not so that they can be our project and share the gospel with, but so that we can be authentic Christians living how and where we do. It's a brilliant little book. Finally, is this finally? Yeah, I think it is. God is already at work in the world. Even before we show up, right? Oh, now that I'm here, the gospel can be preached. Now that I'm here, God can get busy. No, God's already busy before you get there. God's already at work among Muslim people before you get there. God is already at work among Catholic people before you get there. God is already at work among Baptist people before you get there. We just have to have the sensibility to see God at work in the world. And He's working through really mundane stuff, like choosing who's going to be my secretary, like cutting papyrus, like scoring lines on letters, like making copies of letters. God is at work in that stuff too. In the mundane, God is at work. So Paul says, whatever your hand finds to do, right? What do? Do it. And you will bring glory to Christ. Everything that we do is ultimately to the glory and praise of Christ. So God is at work. He is the actor in history. He is the great actor in history. He is not silent. I love the title of that book by Francis Schaeffer. He is there, and He is not silent. He is at work in the world in ways that you and I have not even begun to imagine. We're invited to join Him in that great work. We're invited to celebrate His presence and practice His presence every day. This is what Paul did. As we read his letters, we see it over and again. Well, those are just a few of the things that I've learned about Paul's letters. And I hope that something today about his letters, about his legacy, about his greatness, will touch and influence us. My encouragement would be to read his letters over and over. Read them regularly. Read them every year. And say, I want to be like Paul. Because if I'm like Paul, I'm going to be like Jesus. Let's pray together. Lord, I thank you for the example of the apostle, for all that he did, the bravery that he showed, the care that he showed for his churches, the nurture. And I pray that we will drink deeply from that tradition, that we will look back as well as looking around, and we will embrace all the goodness and beauty and truth that we find expressed in Paul's letters and in those saints and great individuals of the past whom Paul has influenced so greatly. May he be our guide to the Christian faith. May he become for us an example of the gospel. Through Jesus we pray. Amen.